Hi guys, it's Brooke here. I have a super quick favor to ask. When you have a moment, please take just a second to give this podcast a 5-star review. This will help me to continue the podcast and continue to bring these resources to the community. Thank you so much for that 5-star review.
Most people have heard like serotonin because it's often referred to as sort of that feel-good neurotransmitter. And what surprised people and what surprised me the most is that around 90% of serotonin is actually produced in the gut, not in the brain. Serotonin helps regulate mood, emotional stability, resilience, well-being. It's also a precursor to melatonin, our sleep hormone. So if the gut's inflamed or it's imbalanced or not functioning properly, we see all of these ripple effects: mood, anxiety, emotional regulation, and sleep.
Hey there, it's Brooke, and welcome to Finding Hope on the Spectrum, where I have heart-to-heart conversations with parents, professionals, and autistic individuals sharing personal insight and life experiences. Together, we dive deep into supports, programs, and stories that offer inspiration, insight, and most importantly, hope for the neurodiverse community. Before we begin with today's topic, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to this podcast. And if you know someone who this would be helpful for, please pass it along. Remember to always stay curious, be kind, and have an open heart. All right, welcome back to Finding Hope on the Spectrum. I'm super excited about our episode today. Today's episode, I think, is just such an important conversation for parents and caregivers and anybody wanting to better understand ADHD beyond the labels and symptoms. And I'm joined by Dana Kay. She's a board-certified holistic health and nutrition practitioner, founder of the ADHD Thrive Institute, and a leading voice in natural approaches to supporting children with ADHD. And Dana's work was inspired by her own son's diagnosis and the struggles her family faced trying to find answers that truly helped. And really, what I love about her approach is that she looks deeper beyond the behavior. This is such a big thing for me and my work. And I just think it's so important to look beyond the behavior and to really explore the biology behind ADHD symptoms. And today we're going to be talking about the gut-brain connection, inflammation, nutrition, the nervous system regulation, and practical ways families can support their children naturally and holistically. So whether your child has an ADHD or an autism diagnosis, struggles with focus and emotional regulation, or you just simply want to better understand how nutrition and wellness impact behavior, this conversation is going to give you so much to think about. So welcome, Dana.
Thank you so much for having me, Brooke.
Fantastic. Well, let's just dive into it. I love your story and just your level of expertise and everything that you shared with me that we went over before today's episode. And so I want to start with having you just share a little bit more about yourself and your background.
Yeah, look, I am not an American. I do live in America. I live in sunny Seattle, as I always say. I say that because it's not always sunny and cloudy today. So I'm originally from Australia. I am, as you mentioned, a board certified health and nutrition practitioner, international best-selling author, podcast host as well. But most importantly, I am a mum to a boy who completely changed the course of my life. Today I've had the privilege of helping over 1,600 families reduce ADHD symptoms, and autism symptoms, anxiety, all of that naturally. But I never set out to work in ADHD. I was actually an accountant in a past life. Don't tell anyone. But, the reason I do the work that I do today is because I became one of those desperate parents looking for answers. And, when my son was diagnosed with ADHD, I did feel relief. It wasn't my fault. It wasn't that I was a bad mum. And I was told that the symptoms were lifelong, they were progressive, and that medication was essentially our best option. But the more I watched what was happening to him, the more I sort of felt there had to be more to the story. And so, I started out in accounting, thought I would be an accountant for the rest of my life. And, what started as a mother's search for answers eventually became a complete career change, years of education, certifications, clinical experience, and now an absolute mission to help other families understand, as you said, that behavior is often a signal from the body. There's something beneath it, and it's not simply something to suppress.
Absolutely. And I can't wait to dive more into that and what that means to you and kind of what you recommend as well. And when you're supporting your clients. And so, let's kind of go back to the beginning and that season of life with your son's diagnosis.
Mm.
And, what I know you mentioned that medication was recommended. And, I'd love for you just to share a little bit more about that journey that you've been on and your son, and whatever you're comfortable sharing would be fantastic.
Yeah. Look, I'm an open book because I know what it's like to really struggle. Our family was walking on eggshells on this emotional roller coaster on a daily basis, and it was honestly one of the hardest periods of my life. My son was bright, he was loving, he was funny, incredibly energetic, but he was really struggling, and the meltdowns were intense. School was becoming difficulty, social situations were becoming difficult, and as parents we were just absolutely exhausted. And what made it harder was feeling like every appointment that we had with the doctor focused on just like managing the symptoms while nobody was asking why they were actually happening. And I remember feeling like we were constantly reacting to problems rather than understanding them. And, I'm not against medication. The first thing that we're told was, dexmethylphenidate. We put him on that medication. The dosage increases. He started to have some side effects. So they added another medication. And then he had some more side effects. And so they added a third medication. And, as the symptoms escalated, all of those recommendations escalated too. More medication, more intervention, more labels, but very few conversations about what might actually be happening inside his body, and that feeling of being sort of stuck between wanting to help your child and not knowing where to turn is, something I think that many parents understand deeply. And it was a really, really hard time in my life. And, there was this specific moment where I realized we needed to do something differently. For me, it was when the doctors recommended adding a fourth medication. My son was 5, to manage the side effects of the other medications he was already taking. And I remember sitting there thinking, like, how did we get here? We were no longer treating ADHD symptoms. We were treating side effects from medications that were treating side effects from the other medications. And, I had this moment where my instincts became louder than, that fear inside of me. As I said, I'm not anti-medication. I just simply felt that we were missing a much bigger conversation. What if there was another way? What if there was something that was driving this? What if the body was contributing to what we were seeing? And that was the moment that sort of just changed everything for me.
Yeah, incredible. It's fascinating. I've had so many guests on this podcast, moms and dads whose life's path has changed so dramatically from their own child. And I mean, parents are the most passionate and the most driven, the most motivated, I think. Yeah, and really get it. And I love that about your approach, is that you really understand that from a parent's perspective when you're helping other parents. And
Definitely.
I just think that goes so far. And so now you're going on this journey and you're learning about these things. And I know you often say, ADHD symptoms are connected to underlying biological stressors. So if you can share for kind of a beginner who may not have heard that term before, what does that mean?
Yeah, look, one of the biggest shifts I try to teach parents is that symptoms are often a signal. We tend to look at hyperactivity or impulsivity or emotional dysregulation, anxiety, whatever it may be, poor sleep, as these sort of isolated problems that we need to deal with. I see them differently. I see them as the body is waving a flag, because when the body's under stress, the brain feels it. When the gut is inflamed, the brain feels it. If blood sugar is unstable, the brain feels it. If sleep quality is poor, the brain feels it. If nutrient levels are depleted, the brain feels it. And so, the symptom is often the visible part. The stressor underneath is frequently invisible. And so, what I help families identify is that biology beneath those symptoms. And my job is helping those families, work out what might be creating that stress inside the system. Does that
Mm-hmm.
make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I know we see, in the field, we hear so much about the gut brain connection. And, that is such a critical concept to understand. What does that mean? What do you think? Like, and I know you kind of just explained it, but is there anything else you want to share about that part of the gut brain connection and
Oh,
why it's so
it's like,
important?
yeah, look, I think it's, one of the most misunderstood areas in ADHD. Most people think of the gut as a digestive organ.
Mm-hmm.
You eat food, you digest it, you absorb your nutrients, and you move on.
Yeah.
But the gut is actually one of the most influential organs in the body when it comes to brain function.
Mm-hmm.
And the gut and the brain, they're in this constant communication through what we call the gut brain axis. They communicate through the vagus nerve, connecting the gut to the brain. They communicate through neurotransmitters, hormones, the immune system, inflammatory signals. If I had to simplify it, I would say that the gut is constantly sending updates to the brain about what is happening inside the body.
Mm-hmm.
If the gut is unhealthy, the brain hears it. And one of the most fascinating pieces, and this is sort of like that moment where I was like, there's something to this. When I learned this all these years ago, just so you know, my son he was diagnosed at 4. We were on this vicious cycle. He's now 16. He hasn't been on meds for years and he's thriving. But, when I heard about the gut brain connection, I was like, hold on, why has no one ever talked to me about it? It is in relation to neurotransmitter production. Most people have heard like serotonin because it's often referred to as sort of that feel-good neurotransmitter. And what surprised people and what surprised me the most is that around 90% of serotonin is actually produced in the gut, not in the brain. Serotonin helps regulate mood, emotional stability, resilience, well-being. It's also a precursor to melatonin, our sleep hormone. So if the gut's inflamed or it's imbalanced or not functioning properly, we see all of these ripple effects: mood, anxiety, emotional regulation, and sleep. 50% of it is made in the gut, not in the brain. Again, dopamine is hugely indicated in ADHD. The second way the gut affects behavior is through inflammation. 70% of our immune system sits around the gut. And when the gut becomes irritated from things like food sensitivities, bacterial imbalances, yeast overgrowth, I could go on and on, the immune system gets activated, and the immune activation creates inflammatory chemicals. And those inflammatory chemicals don't stay in the gut. They circulate through the body and eventually affect the brain. Now, we know that inflammation is a huge influencer of neurotransmitter production, brain signaling, emotional regulation, cognitive function, which is why I often say inflammation in the gut becomes inflammation in the brain. And when the brain is inflamed, hyperactivity, impulsivity, poor focus, anxiety, the main area that the gut talks to is the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is responsible for attention, focus, executive function, planning, organizing, all of the things that are impacted when you get an ADHD diagnosis. The third piece is nutrient absorption. Parents can be feeding their kids an amazing diet, but if the gut is not functioning properly, those nutrients may not be getting absorbed efficiently. And nutrients matter because the brain is one of the most nutrient demanding organs in the body. It needs zinc, magnesium, iron, omega-3s, and countless other nutrients to create a lot of those neurotransmitters and regulate the nervous system. So if the gut isn't absorbing those nutrients well, the brain is essentially trying to operate with limited resources. But I know one of the things when I say this to families about the gut brain connection, a lot of the things that they will say is like, well, my kid's got no gut issues. There's no constipation, there's no stomach aches, there's no diarrhea. They go to the toilet every day. And I use one of my favorite examples, a little girl named Sophia. She came into our program, had significant anxiety, emotional outbursts, OCD, difficult focusing. And if you'd ask her parents about gut symptoms, she didn't have any. None of the symptoms that I mentioned. Nothing would make you think gut issue. But we actually ran functional lab testing and we found significant issues, parasite, H. pylori, bacterial overgrowth. And so as we worked to improve her gut, her emotional regulation improved, her OCD disappeared, her focus got better, and that is just something I see over and over again. So, we're often waiting for those digestive symptoms before considering the gut, but many times the gut isn't speaking through that digestion, it's speaking through behavior.
Yeah, that's incredible. I mean, there's so much more I could go on. I could ask about that. And I know we're going to talk about some testing, but just curious, since you shared that, kind of what testing do you do for a case like that when you're wanting to find out if the gut is healthy?
Yeah, look, I love testing. I think it gives you, and I'm going to say data. I know Americans say data. I don't think I've been here for like 12 years and I don't think I'm ever going to get used to saying the word data. It just won't come out of my mouth. But, let's lead with data. Like, functional lab testing gives us the information about that child. So we're not trying to pin the tail on the donkey. I really love to do urine and stool and finger pricks. So, one of the things is we're looking for foods that are currently causing inflammation so we can temporarily remove them so we can work on healing the gut. So we're doing food sensitivity testing. We're looking at leaky gut as well. Is that gut leaking? Is it able to absorb its nutrients properly? We're looking at urine testing. One of my favorite tests is called an organic acid test. It looks at over 70 different important markers in the body, how it's functioning. It looks for gut health, yeast overgrowth, mold colonization, bacterial overgrowth. It looks at your neurotransmitters, so your serotonin and your dopamine. It looks at B vitamins and other nutrients in there. And one of the other main ones that I do a lot of testing, but there's sort of 4 main ones that we do to start, is called a cryptopyrrole test. And I know that we discussed that. I think it's one of the biggest game changers, especially when it comes to ADHD and autism. Cryptopyrrole is like this normal process that happens in the body. But when these pyrrole levels are elevated, they have a dramatic affinity for zinc and B6, and so can draw those elements out of the body into the urine. So you become deficient in zinc and B6. But in the general population, it's elevated in about 3% of the general population. I think I've run over 2,000 of these tests, and I see it elevated in 40% of kids with ADHD. And so it's really, really common. And, symptoms of cryptopyrrole are poor mood dysregulation, depression, anxiety, aggression, sensitivity to light and sound, tactile sensitivities, poor dream recall. You don't have to have all symptoms to be suffering from it. So I think let's look at what's going on for that child. Every child is different.
Yeah.
Every child has different nutrient requirements. Every child has different underlying biological stresses that are going on in their body. So that's why I love testing, just to give us that baseline so we can develop a plan and move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that it just gives you such definitive information.
Yes.
So, and that the food sensitivity is fascinating as well. And I'd love to have you share a little bit more about kind of common foods that you see can have an impact on the ADHD symptoms and what you recommend for that.
Yeah, look, this is sort of where I think, parents need a bit more of a clarity. I never want to create fear around food. Food should not become another battlefield in a home. We don't need more of that, especially with ADHD and autism. But after working with more than 1,600 families, there are certain foods and ingredients that I do see come up over and over again. The biggest ones are gluten, dairy, artificial dyes and flavors, ultra processed foods and excess sugar. And I just want to maybe just go into explaining why, especially around gluten and dairy. They can be a big issue for many kids, especially when you've got a gut that's inflamed or leaky.
Yeah.
When gluten is not broken down properly, it can create compounds called glutamorphins. And when dairy is not broken down properly, it can create compounds called casomorphins. And these are opioid-like peptides, casomorphins, morphine, glutamorphins, sounds like morphine. So they're these opioid-like peptides. And what that means is they can interact with the opioid receptors in the brain. And so for some kids, that gluten and dairy, it's not just food. They dramatically affect the mood, the behavior, focus, emotional regulation. And this is why some parents might say, well, my child acts addicted to bread and to carbs or to cheese and milk. Sometimes it's not just that they love it, it's their body that is reacting to those opioid-like compounds. And if their gut barrier is compromised, those digested peptides may be more likely to move through the gut lining and create more immune and neurological effects. So gluten and dairy can be sort of a double hit. They can inflame the gut. For some kids, they can also act and affect the brain with those opioid-like compounds if they're not broken down properly. Then we've got artificial dyes and flavors. This is a big one. I'm sure many families have heard about them. It's been in the news, especially the dyes lately. And there's a lot of research out there that shows just how sensitive those synthetic additives can be for kids in causing hyperactivity and impulsivity after foods with dyes and artificial ingredients. And they're really not food. They're not nourishing any part of the body in any way or the brain in any way. So it's really easy. They're sort of easy wins to remove, and they're not adding anything beneficial. Sugar is another major one. It's not, itself evil, but excess sugar creates these blood sugar spikes and crashes. And when blood sugar crashes, the body releases stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. And in children, what does that look like? Anxiety, irritability, hyperactivity, poor focus, defiance. So when parents say my child melts down every afternoon, one of the first things I want to know is, what do they eat for breakfast, snack, and lunch? And and so we can really stabilize that blood sugar throughout the day. So there are a couple of the main ones that I see. The body really needs to start reducing that inflammatory load, and there's some easy ones to start with. Ideally, I like to personalize with testing. I like to look at a wheat zoomer and a dairy zoomer to see, are they reacting? Do they have those peptides, those opioid-like peptides? And so you can have that data and go, yes, they're highly reactive. But if you can't afford testing, you can just do a simple removal.
Yeah. And I was just thinking about how, when kids are so used to, or maybe even addicted to eating the gluten and the dairy, do you have recommendations for families on helping them to navigate that process? And also,
definitely, like for all the,
go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say the other add-on question would be, there's so many gluten-free products out there, and just curious your take on that too.
Yeah, definitely. Look, for every family that works works with us and inside our program, we provide lots of recipe guides, shopping lists, for good alternatives, and provide them the support and the resources that they need to make that easy change step by step. I don't suggest removing everything overnight. When my son was going through this, I think on day one we removed gluten, dairy, soy, artificial flavors, artificial colors, and 40 food sensitivities on day one. Let's just say I ended up in multiple panic attacks, crying on the floor of my bedroom, and it is not the way that I teach families to do it. I always say Rome's not built in a day. You can't make these changes in a day. But, it's a really good question around the gluten-free products, because going gluten-free, replacing packaged goods with packaged goods doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get anywhere. A lot of gluten-free foods are just as bad as packaged foods. They've got those, processed ingredients in them. They've got, artificial flavors or gums. And so it's making sure you're choosing the right type of packaged foods and getting a balance, If we can say, that 80-20 rule with whole foods versus packaged foods, then we're doing a lot better. But just replacing a packaged food with a packaged food's not going to get you to where you need to go.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you typically recommend mostly organic food too for your clients?
Yeah, look, I always like to, when we talk about organic food, a lot of foods out there are highly sprayed with pesticides or are genetically modified. That can create further inflammation in the body. I'm not about fear-mongering, though. There's a lot of social media out there where, someone will focus on one thing and then put the fear of life into families. We don't need that. Families don't need more stress. And so, I sort of say I love the ewg.org website. It can really guide families to say, okay, let's look at the foods. They've got something called the clean 15 and the dirty dozen. The clean 15 are the foods that have the least amount of pesticides on them. So, if you've got budget, if you need to manage your budget, you can buy non-organic for the clean 15. But if you're going to eat foods on the dirty dozen, which are the top 12 foods that have, the hugest numbers of pesticides on them, then you definitely want to go organic for those. And then everywhere in between is really based on that family's budget. I couldn't buy everything organic. My budget doesn't, allow for 100% organic. And so we really have to meet the family where they are and focus what's the most important. Is a little bit of non-organic food going to be the be-all and end-all? No, it won't. If we're reducing inflammation, as a casting a wider net, a little bit here, a little bit there is really going to help reduce that load on that child's body.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and I think that's important. I love that. I'm going to make sure to put that website you mentioned in the show notes as well, so families can access that resource. And anything else that you have, any other resources as well, we'll make sure to include for families. And so just talk about, what the role of sleep plays in ADHD. I know you've mentioned sleep a little. Some kids can have a hard time with sleep.
Yeah.
Let's talk about how sleep is important and the symptoms as well that come with lack of sleep.
Yeah, look, sleep is 100% critical. What does a tired brain look like? An ADHD brain. And so, I really want to make sure, we're protecting that sleep and making sure that there's no underlying issues that are stopping that child sleeping. So one of those is mouth breathing. You want to make sure your child is not actually breathing through the mouth when they're sleeping. And that could be an indication that they have sleep apnea. And so, we want to make sure that they're not mouth breathing. If they do, you definitely want to see a sleep specialist, get tested for sleep apnea, and because that can really look identical to ADHD. We also want to make sure, they're not grinding their teeth or have that restless sleep, sweating at night. When they're sweating at night or they're waking up at 1 a.m. to 3 a.m., that could mean that their detox pathways are overloaded. And so we really want to, because that's when you do your most detoxing. Your liver is struggling at that time. And so we want to make sure that that's not happening. And if it is, then that's a sign that they're struggling and we need to support that liver so they can sleep. Another thing, as I mentioned earlier, like serotonin is a precursor to melatonin. If your gut's under functioning, you're not producing that amount of serotonin that you need, you're not going to be able to produce the right amount of melatonin, which is our sleep hormone. And so, all of this is connected. A child can be in bed for 10 hours and still not getting good sleep if, that oxygenation or that airway is compromised, and so, when, sleep is when the brain clears that waste, when it resets the body, neurotransmitters, when it repairs, when it regulates inflammation. So sleep is absolutely critical, and we can use it as some signs for deeper issues that could be going on.
So is it fair to say, based on what you just shared, that if a child kind of appears to be sleeping, but they may not be getting restful sleep, even though they're not up moving? A lot of kids with autism and adults have a hard time sleeping, and it's clear they're not sleeping. They're up, they're getting dysregulated in the middle of the night. I have many clients that experience that challenge. But in this case, are there kids with ADHD that seem to be sleeping, but they're not actually getting restful sleep?
Yeah, definitely. And so, really looking at those clues, really going, okay, well, do they wake up wired and tired? Are they mouth breathing? Are they snoring? Are they grinding their teeth? Do they have that restless sleep? Are they sweating at night or waking sort of unrefreshed? And so it is important to look for those clues, and that can definitely point to deeper issues. But if they're sleeping and they're, sleeping restfully and they're sleeping with their mouth shut, then, generally it's probably okay.
Okay. That's really significant. I had not heard that. I'm glad that you shared that.
Yeah, it's one of those key pieces that we look at inside our program and direct families to resources if they need it, because, sleep apnea can definitely mimic an ADHD brain.
I didn't even think about kids having sleep apnea too.
Yeah,
That's
you don't.
fascinating.
You apply it to probably like a 50-year-old man, don't you?
Exactly. Yes.
My son actually had it. It was one of the key pieces for him. It wasn't the be all and end all for him, but he would actually sleepwalk. And we would find him, out the back garden in the middle of the night. Luckily, it would always happen before midnight. And so we were usually generally awake when it happened, but he ended up needing to get his adenoids removed. He would also wet the bed. This was at the age of 11 or 12. And as soon as we got that rectified, he stopped wetting the bed. He stopped sleepwalking. And, it was a big game changer in some of his symptoms as well.
This show is brought to you by Therapeutic Approach to Growth. Therapeutic Approach to Growth helps families with relationship and behavioral needs. Their holistic programs are individualized to honor and respect each family and their autistic son or daughter's sense of self through programs such as relationship development intervention, naturalistic ABA, and animal-assisted services. If you're finding yourself frustrated or discouraged with your current behavioral programs and would like to see more long-term meaningful growth for you and your family, then contact TAG today at www.tagforgrowth, that's TAGFORGROWTH.com, to learn more about how to schedule a consultation or how they can offer you the help your family needs, whether in person, remotely, or in a school setting. Again, that's www.tagforgrowth.com.
Amazing. Fascinating. I mean, it's just such a testament to going deeper and really getting to the bottom of what is happening. It's causing these challenges.
Yes, definitely.
Well, I also want to talk about blood sugar regulation and protein. Now, everybody's talking about protein now, which I think is so great in all, nutritional arenas. So let's talk about that and how that impacts focus and regulation and emotions and all the things.
Yeah, both of those are huge. The brain, it needs this steady fuel, and so when kids eat sort of this carb-heavy breakfast like cereal, waffles, muffins, or toast alone, as I was saying earlier, blood sugar rises really quickly. And what goes up must come crashing down. And that crash triggers those stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. And when you think about adrenaline, racing, hyperactivity, anxiety, irritability, unable to focus. So blood sugar regulation is huge. I've got this tip, no naked carb rule. And so if your child eats a carb, you always want to pair it with a protein or a fat, and that will help stabilize that blood sugar. Protein, huge. It gives the brain amino acids, and amino acids are the building blocks of our neurotransmitters. And so, we really want to make sure we're focusing on, about 0.8 grams of protein to every pound of body weight. I will say, though, some kids, depending on their genetics, don't do well with a lot of protein. So again, it requires that personalization to determine what is good for that child. Also, those protein needs are obviously going to go up and down depending on the activity level of that child. Are they doing sports? Things like that. Healthy fats, as I mentioned, they slow that blood sugar rise and they really support that nervous system. And so I think, one of the fastest wins can really be that no naked carb rule, especially at breakfast time. It's not magic. It's biology.
Yes, absolutely. I love that. No naked carbs. I'm going to use that. Oh, that's cute. Well, and a lot of kids can be really picky eaters too. So, why is that so common? And what do you suggest?
Yeah, look, it's a big one. I would say about 70% of the families that we work with have a picky eater, and it's not just this stubbornness from them. I know with kids with autism, ADHD, it might be sensory, texture, smell, color, appearance, all of that's overwhelming. But what I find is that when we can reduce inflammation in the body,
Mm-hmm.
the palate starts opening up. It can also be gut related. If digestion is poor, a child may avoid foods because their body associates it with discomfort.
Yeah.
It can be nutrient related. Zinc, super important to check when you've got a picky eater. If you are low in zinc, it actually changes your taste perception. There is a number of studies around that. It will change your taste perception and your appetite. So first thing, if you've got a picky eater, get the zinc levels checked, and it's really easy just to supplement with zinc. But if it starts out as gut inflammation or inflammation in the body or low zinc, it does become this vicious cycle. Okay. So, it started out as that. Their taste perception was off. They became picky. We as parents, we do what we know to do. We feed them whatever they will eat. We will give them what they will ever eat. So it becomes this emotional cycle. We've given them the food that they want. Of course, they're going to want more of that. And when they know mum will give them whatever they want or dad will give them whatever they want, they will want more of it, and they'll continue to say no to the other food. So it's like this vicious cycle. Something started the picky eating, then the picky eating became this, more behavioral, emotional side of things. And so we need to fix what the underlying root cause is and then really bring in some strategies to lower the pressure and build the safety back around that food, And so we have a number of strategies that we teach inside the program. One of those is called the Family Food Challenge. I love using it because it really takes that pressure off. We do it as a family. We sit down as a family and go, okay, look, the doctors mentioned that we need to eat a more variety of food because we're not getting the nutrients that our body needs. It's all of us. We're doing it together. And so we're going to do a family food challenge. It's going to be really fun. Each week we're going to pick one new food. The first week I'll pick. Next week, Johnny can pick. Next week, Sarah can pick. And every day we're going to try that same food. It might be one blueberry, and everyone's going to get a blueberry on the plate before dinner hits the table. Everyone's going to look at the blueberry. They're going to touch it to their lips. They're going to smell it. We're going to taste a bite of it. We're going to talk about the taste and texture. And after we do that, we're going to get a tick on the chart as a family. And we're going to have a family reward at the end of the week. What reward should we have together as a family? It also brings back that family camaraderie because, having a child with ADHD and autism is stressful, and it really starts to break some of those bonds, and we're all stressed and our family's walking on eggshells, and, we're living in this fight or flight, and our family has adapted to that. So bringing something fun back into our life as a family and doing something together helps rebuild that. So it might be, you go and do bowling. You have a family games night. Everyone has different types of rewards, and you choose that as a family. So you want to start the week with something that that your child will eat because you want it to start to be fun and exciting. And you do that every single day for 7 days, the same food. Why? Because it can take 15 to 20 times for a kid to accept a new flavor and new texture. And so a lot of the time we go, here's a blueberry. They go, no, I don't like it. And you go, okay, I'm never buying it again. Yeah. But that 7 days really gets you further through that. And then next week they choose the food. You can print out the color of the rainbows of fruits and veggies. And so they can pick from there. And it might be a little bit of a cucumber. And every day for 7 days, you'll try it. You look back in 3 weeks' time, you've done that every day for 3 weeks. And you flip the script in your house. You're now the family that tries new food. And so that's one of the biggest things. We also do things like food chaining and have other strategies that we help families with.
And what is that? What's food chaining?
Food chaining is, so a lot of families come into my program and I've got a smoothie guide. They read the smoothie guide and they go straight for that green smoothie that has all of these nutrients in it. I'm like, yes, we're going to get our kid to drink it. But that kid's been used to drinking chocolate milk, and that's it. So you can't expect a kid to go from chocolate milk straight to a green smoothie. So what we do is we chain them from where they are to where they want to go. So we start with that chocolate milk. And then, if we're trying to go dairy-free, we may go, okay, well, let's do 75% normal milk, 25% dairy-free milk, and give them that.
Yeah.
They won't even notice it. Then we might make it, then we'll reduce the percentage or whatever.
Yeah.
Then we might go, okay, well, we'd normally do it with, I don't know, what's an instant chocolate powder or syrup that you put in chocolate milk. We might buy a better version of that, a better one that doesn't have artificial ingredients, and do that.
Yeah.
Then what we might do is we might get that better version of that chocolate dairy-free milk. We might pop it in the blender and blend in maybe 2 blackberries. Okay? And then all of a sudden they're starting to get some fruit in there. Then we might reduce that powder and bring in some cocoa powder instead, which is a better for you. And so what we're doing is we're taking these little small slow steps. We're not asking them to go from chocolate milk to a green smoothie tomorrow.
Yeah.
We're chaining them to where we want to go. Then we might pop in, some tiny bit of kale without them knowing. We might pop in a banana. And so we're just making these little changes to get them where they need to go. It's the same with things like chicken nuggets. You buy the store-bought chicken nuggets. Let's buy a better version for you. Then let's move them to homemade chicken nuggets. Then let's move them to homemade pork nuggets. So we're changing the food. We're not taking away the food that they're used to. We're slowly changing the texture, the flavor, the seasonings. Just mix it up.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. I think it's what stands out to me is that you're really giving the parents the tools to be successful, because it can feel so overwhelming to go from one end to the other. And how do you get there without major upset? And you're already dealing with upset anyway.
100%. And I know it can feel so overwhelming, but when you've got the support on a daily basis and you've got that community around you and you've got the tools and just that ear to go, like, what do I do next? Having that step-by-step approach of going, okay, well, this is what I do next. It's not so overwhelming. As I said, Rome wasn't built in a day. If this takes you 6 months, if it takes you 9 months, if it takes you longer, at the end of the day, when they're graduating college or going off to, trade school or whatever, an extra couple of months in the whole scheme of things, it's going to be a little blip.
Yes, so true. It's so true. These little changes lead to big change. And I'm excited for you to share in a minute too about kind of your program and how you offer the support and that structure of it, because I think that's going to be really important for people to know about. And so looking at, like all of the food changes, are there any other kind of lifestyle habits or changes that you would recommend, within the home to supporting this process?
Yeah, look, I think that, as I mentioned earlier, what we're trying to do is we're trying to reduce the total inflammatory load, and we're trying to optimize the body. The body's a beautiful thing. The body can do what it needs to do when it's given the right tools, the right ingredients, and the right inputs. Sleep. We talked about that. Consistent sleep, morning protein. One of the biggest, easiest, cheapest ways to help is daily movement. Movement, exercise, it helps detox the body. It helps build neurotransmitters. It supports cognitive function. It helps with learning. And so, that's a cheap, easy one that anyone can implement. Doesn't need to be something structured. It can be just get out in the backyard, jump on that trampoline. I love the trampoline because it not only fires off neurons in the brain. I always used to get my boys out there before school to help fire off their neurons, get rid of some of their hyperactivity, help with their detoxification. That's a really great way to tackle a number of things in one go. Sunlight. Our sunshine vitamin D, it is so critical for so many of the neurotransmitter productions. A lot of our kids are, deficient in vitamin D. One of the cheapest ways to get it is from outdoor light. But I will say there are a number of kids that, have underlying compromised genetics that don't let them receive and process and transport that vitamin D the right way. And that's when supplementation can come in. And reduce screen time. I know that that's really hard. Screens are here. They're part of our life. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but when it's left unchecked and monitored, it can become a bad thing, and it can lead to that addiction, that dopamine hit that these kids are craving. Let's work out why they're craving that dopamine. Let's look underneath biology. But, in the meantime, it's interesting. Sugar's the same thing as a screen. What happens in the body is they get this dopamine hit. Their dopamine receptors in their brain are like, whoo, whoo, whoo. And when there's too much dopamine in the brain, what it does, it down regulates those dopamine receptors. And so, because it doesn't want so much. And so to get the same woo, 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 it actually needs more dopamine hit to make the same response. And so that's why you see this vicious cycle of this addiction to sugar does the same thing. Screens does the same thing. So, just some simple things and simple changes can really go a long way. It doesn't need to be complicated. As I said, a walk, a trampoline, a bike ride, play outside. It can be better than medicine for the nervous system.
Yeah, it's so true. It is so true. I mean, I see that with my kids, and they don't want to go and work out or go to their soccer or whatever it is, and then they come back and they're like, "Oh, that feels so good."
Yes, it does, doesn't it?
Yes. Yeah. Sometimes they just don't know it. That's what they need. They need a little nudge.
Yes.
Oh, what do you think are the biggest misconceptions people have about ADHD?
Yeah, look, there's a number of misconceptions. I think that, if we go on the theme of what we've been talking about today, is that I think that the biggest misconception is ADHD is just purely a brain issue. Let's be clear, ADHD absolutely affects the brain. The symptoms are real, the struggles are real, the diagnosis is real. But where I think we oversimplify the conversation is when we act as though the brain exists in isolation from the rest of the body. The brain is connected to everything, just like I talked about with the gut, the immune system, inflammation, sleep, nutrient status, blood sugar regulation, hormones. And so the ADHD conversations that we're having at diagnosis and at the doctors focus almost exclusively on the brain itself. And, as I've demonstrated and what I've found with working over 1,600 families is that many children have those underlying biological stressors that are turning up the volume on their symptoms, and so when I say ADHD is not purely a brain issue, I'm not saying the diagnosis isn't real. I'm saying that the brain does not operate independently from the body. And if we ignore everything happening below the neck, we are missing important opportunities to help a child function better. Another misconception is that symptoms are the problem. I look at symptoms, like I mentioned, as signals. I see them as information, the hyperactivity, the emotional outbursts, the poor focus. They are signals that something in the system may be under stress. So I always encourage parents to ask not just how do we better manage this symptom, but what might be contributing to this symptom. And that shift in thinking changes everything.
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, you get to the root cause and it's amazing. I mean, it's a really, I believe wholeheartedly that's the way to go to have the biggest impact. And, we want our kids to thrive. We want them to feel good in their bodies and to feel successful and to be available, to learn and to grow and, be there, reach their potential. So,
and parents also deserve a family that's balanced and that's happy and it's not constantly in this fight or flight stress. And I think that's the hardest thing, especially as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so true because everybody affects each other in the family dynamic and the siblings as well. So, yeah. Now, what would be something kind of the research now shows that parents still don't know? Are you following the research and kind of what's in the field?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's the research on the natural side of things is fascinating. I mean, one that most I've shared obviously is that the gut and brain, they're deeply connected. It influences neurotransmitters, immune signaling, inflammation, nutrient absorption, all of that. So that's sort of like at the forefront. Yeah. Also food and how it's deeply connected to a lot of the symptoms that we're experiencing. But these things are not part of the conversation when a child's first diagnosed. And so like a lot of it's focused on that. It's interesting, unfortunately, to create research and peer-reviewed studies, it's very expensive to do that. And the funding usually comes from pharmaceutical companies and insurance companies. And so, a lot of the money to get the money to do those peer-reviewed studies on supplementation and things like that is not in the best interests of the profit of the pharmaceutical companies. Medication's there for a purpose. I get it. I'm not totally against it. But, I wish that the funding would be there. Another thing that I will say around science is that it's, obviously I live in the US, been here for, my children are grown up here. But when it comes to the FDA, especially around food in America, to what you need to do in terms of a food and putting something in a food product is you actually need to, it's good until it's proven guilty. So it's kind of like the court system. Whereas in Australia and in the UK, you need to prove that it is okay for human consumption before it's added to a product. So all of the big food companies here, they're not going to try and disprove prove that something is not good for human consumption. Why would they? They want to include it in their product. It's cheap, it's easy, it creates flavor for a product. And so I think that the science around that is a bit backwards, but definitely there is so much research out there these days around, some of those key nutrients, some of that gut brain, like huge gut brain connection, and around some of that food that, exacerbates ADHD symptoms.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's why we're so unhealthy as a culture. That makes a lot of sense and so sad.
It is. It is sad. Yeah.
We just have to do our own research and, be informed.
Yep.
So, well, let's talk. I want to make sure we have a chance to share about your Thrive Institute and, what you're offering and the structure of it, and so that our listeners can better understand what that looks like.
Yeah, definitely. I don't get asked this question often, so thank you for asking it. Our mission is to, if we can just touch 1% of the kids that are diagnosed with ADHD to help them thrive at home, at school, and in life, then we're achieving our mission. When you have a child that's diagnosed with ADHD or autism, it's a lonely place. You feel like you're on this island on your own. And so we really provide families a structured step-by-step process to reducing symptoms naturally. We look at the whole child, not just the symptoms. And so depending on the program, we talk to every family. We offer a free ADHD Thrive breakthrough call because, we want to hear about that child. We want to hear their symptoms. We want to know their health history. We want to know their family dynamics, what they've tried, what's worked, what hasn't worked, and really develop a game plan for that specific child. Every child is a bio-individual. And so depending on what that plan looks like, it may include that functional lab testing. We send kits all across America to your house. You take the samples, urine, stool, finger prick, you send them back to the labs. You don't need to go anywhere to do it. And from that, we build out a personalized protocol. It could be food, nutritional guidance, supplementation, gut healing, coaching, education, community, ongoing support. And so really focuses on reducing that inflammatory load on the body, restoring what the body's missing, and then renewing that family life. Because, a lot of the time when the kid starts to feel better internally, the whole family is adapted to ADHD, is adapted to autism. The family is in this, mode of like living in that stress response. So we need to renew that and retrain that household so that that kid can thrive, that family can thrive and be successful. We're not just handing families a pile of information and left alone. It's like when you go to a doctor, you get a test, they give you a medication or a supplement, and you're on your way. Right. This is a fully step-by-step handheld approach to helping your child and your family through this.
Yeah, incredible. I mean, what a great resource. And I'm so grateful for what you're offering for this community. And it's just so important. And it's not always the first line of recommendation with the diagnosis. So I think it's so important for families to have the resources and knowledge. And then you also have a book you mentioned and a podcast. You're very busy. Yes. So feel free if you want to share your podcast and what that's all about and your book as well. And again, we'll include those resources in the show notes too.
Yeah, definitely. So my book, I usually have a copy on my desk. I don't know if you can see it. Actually, it's there. Those books there.
Oh, okay.
Thriving with ADHD, a guide to naturally reducing ADHD symptoms in your child. It's available on Amazon. It's available cheaper on my website if you prefer to get it there. Really, the book that I needed all those years ago when my son was going through this. It's an international bestseller. So yeah, it's just, it was my life's work basically of, and making families feel like they're not alone on an island. My podcast is called the Soaring Child Podcast. It's, every child with ADHD deserves to soar. And I do episodes, I interview experts who are working in this field every day. And, I'm on social media at ADHD Thrive Institute, on YouTube, Instagram at ADHD Thrive Institute.
Fantastic. Oh, I love it. It's so great. Well, I'm going to definitely look into getting your book too, because I would love to check that out and have that as a resource for our clients too. So I think it's all wonderful, everything you're doing. And I'm just so grateful that we had this chance to connect today and to share more. And, I just appreciate you being here. So thank you so much, Dina.
I appreciate you having me on. This has been an absolute pleasure. I've, thoroughly enjoyed it. You've had some great questions and, what you're doing as well to get, that to help those families out there is amazing.
Yeah, thank you. Wonderful. Well, have a wonderful day.
I'm dancing on the edge again. The wind is calling my name. I'm dancing on the edge again. This time I'm not looking back there. You can change me, you can tell me down. I'll be echoes in every place I find. I break the molds with the rebels mind. I'm a hurricane of free born mind.
The information provided on this podcast is for general informational purposes only. The content shared is based on the experiences, opinions, and perspectives of the hosts and their guests and should not be construed as medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment recommendations. The discussions and topics covered are intended to foster understanding and awareness of autism therapies, but are not a substitute for professional medical guidance. Before making any decisions regarding therapies or treatments, we strongly encourage you to consult with a qualified healthcare provider who can provide personalized recommendations based on your unique circumstances. By listening to this podcast, you acknowledge and agree that the hosts, guests, and producers are not responsible for any consequences, damages, or outcomes arising from the use or application of any information during the show.